Hey everybody, this is Catalin, and in today's podcast, I have a fairly interesting gentleman sitting across, and his name is Doug Tatum. He's the chairman of the Newport Board Group, a national partnership of CEOs and senior executives who advise emerging middle market companies and assist private equity firms to invest in and grow portfolio companies. He's also the author of No Man's Land, where growing companies fail, which is a leading and national bestseller on really the transition that companies make from being too small to be big, but too big to be small. So really fortunate to have this conversation with Doug today. I read his book and went through it, and it specifically changed my business and transformed a lot of things I was seeing. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, well, thanks. I'm glad to be here, Caleb.
So, Doug, I guess let's start with this. Before we get into the book, and I do have a lot we're gonna talk about there. I would just love to briefly understand your story, how you got to this point, writing the book that you've done, and then we're getting to the actual book contents and everything. If you can give us the context there.
Well, it started obviously years ago. My brother and I had a firm that got quite large in the United States eventually, but in the early days, we were working with emerging growth companies. And I remember sitting down and making the comment that we were seeing a pattern of failure on a regular basis, and that failure um, was so prominent and so consistent. I made the comment, it's like these companies are stuck in no man's land, these patterns. And shortly thereafter, I wrote a short pamphlet where I conceived of the four M's: that there was a transition in the market, in a company's management, in their economic model or business model, and finally how they position themselves in the capital markets and how the capital markets position or were attracted to them at that time. And wrote a little pamphlet, and thousands of them started being used around the country, which eventually led to the book. But ultimately, it was the observation of working as a consulting CFO, which is what the firm was that we built with companies, and the patterns that we saw that led to the idea.
Right. So, okay, and getting into the actual book, because I mean that's where probably the audience is going to have the most interesting things. Like I told you, there's a lot of people that have companies, a lot of people have startups, and also there's a lot of people at the high level with like 500, 1,000, 2,000 employees that are listening. If you can you please describe first the thesis of the book and what No Man's Land is, and then we kind of go with the conversation.
So the book lays out the transitions, as you indicated earlier, of companies that are too big to be small, too small to be big. I think anyone watching this who's in a company, uh, and we use employees because revenues are different based on the types of companies, but typically between 20 and 100 employees is the most acute transition of being too big to be small, too small to be big. So, in typical average revenue terms, you're talking about a $5 million business to a 25 to $40 million business. And the transitions that are outlined in the book are around the marketplace, the management, as I indicated earlier, the model, and the money. So, for example, um, typically companies that are entrepreneurial companies, they grow and win their first customers primarily on the 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 talents of the entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
What happens is that as the company starts trying to scale, the entrepreneur runs out of bandwidth. It's just you can't outwork no man's land. And the result of that is that the company has to determine, does it have a value proposition? In other words, something that its customers are rewarding it for by selecting them, that are beyond the individual efforts of the entrepreneur. Another way of looking at it would be, can the company become good at what the entrepreneur is good at? And if it can scale. If it can't, then the company needs to remain what we call a small giant. A buddy of mine wrote a book, Bo Burlingham. It's an excellent read on staying small and making money, and there's nothing illegal or unethical about doing that. And a lot of times we need to tell entrepreneurs it's okay to stay small and you know and uh, make money. But in the context of the book itself, there's a process by which a company, an entrepreneur, moves the company from a value proposition they're intimately involved in delivering directly to customers to setting up processes that do the same thing. And if they can do that, they can grow to the next level, which obviously leads to management. Um, the best way maybe to illustrate that is that in the early stages, entrepreneurs run companies. They look a little bit like third grade soccer, since you're from Europe. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Everybody running around, nobody playing positions, and they got to transition to playing soccer by positions. And that typically means that the inner circle that the entrepreneur has got to be changed out. And that's a very painful, very emotional process because entrepreneurs have a group of people that have been with them from the beginning, and very few of them transition to scale, financial scale.
Right.
And so, that's the kind of, so if you can imagine, the book is primarily around the case studies of companies and how they found their value proposition that allowed them to scale, and how the entrepreneur worked their way out of doing all the work, transition their management team. And then obviously the company's got to have a model that makes money beyond what we call high performance, cheap labor, costs normalize. And so there has to be a profitable economic model at scale. And then finally, at least in the US, and I'm sure it's the same way in Europe, capital is very difficult to find in that transition period. So we talk about, you know, how do you get the risk out of a business? How do you attract the capital? And then we give some case studies. So that's kind of a little summary of the book and the four M's in that respect.
Right. And just, I would love to go into a little bit detail, into a little detail about each of them. But before we do that, because this was really resonating with me when I read the book, you describe really how it feels and looks like to be in the no man's land in the first place. And like, how can people realize they have a problem and they're transitioning? Because I know for me, when I reached about 23 people, I believe, I was working so hard and doing all these things that I thought it was normal for me to work 18 hours every single day. So I assumed it's normal. I didn't assume it's a problem. So how can people figure out how does it feel and looks like when they're there and there's need to be starting to take action on these four M's?
Well, I think what the entrepreneurs and good business people are control freaks.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a sense that you're losing control. Uh, you know, another symptom is that the business stalls growth, and the old levers that you used to pull to grow the business don't work anymore, and you don't understand why. The third is that if you really think about it, the way you win new customers a lot of times is a customer comes to you as an entrepreneur and asks you to do something that you've never done before, right? And you go, and they ask you, can you do it? And you go, yeah, we're an expert at it, even though you've never done it before.
Mm-hmm.
But because you're managing the promises and the operations, you sequence the priorities of everybody day to day to meet those promises. And in those promises is ultimately a scalable value proposition. But what happens is you end up with multiple ones of them. And so you try to delegate, you let somebody else make a promise, they make a bad promise, you got to clean up, or you let go of some of the operations and they don't sequence the priorities correct. So you're at that point where you feel like, I don't have tight control of this business and I don't know how to grow it. If that helps you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I know exactly. So that does make sense. So I think one other interesting thing I want to point out, and then go into the detail about each M, was what were the numbers that you mentioned in the book, like between the startup phase and then going to the transition, then after, like how many companies actually make it through the transition? And of course, some choose to be small and remain there, but what were the numbers that you mentioned? I think those are worth putting
Well,
out.
and those have been updated. So in the book, I was able to get Dr. David Birx, formerly of MIT and Harvard, who had a time series database of every company in the United States, and he also confirmed that that if you can get escape velocity out of no man's land, that 20 to 40 to 100 employees, that those companies that do generated almost all the net employment in the United States. We continue that database. It now exists in a major university in the United States. And what you find is that, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but probably less than 1 or 2% of all companies actually drive themselves through no man's land. There's a lot of companies, approximately a million in the United States out of 18 million or so, that are in that too big to be small, too small to be big. You get north of that, and you're dealing with a couple of 100,000 businesses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's
So,
about, go
yeah.
ahead.
Well, it's a very steep funnel.
Right. Um, and talking about, I think it would be good just to take the four M's and if briefly described what can people do about them. And the first one is the market. So for example, just to put a little bit of context, my personal scenario, the way I've grown the business that I run right now, was exactly like you mentioned in one of your talks and also in the book, which is kind of interesting. But we got some initial clients that we delivered really well on. Then those recommended us, and we end up with this clients that were all the same. And that's where we were. What we realized though is doubling down on the same clients we had would be a mistake in a 5-10 year window. So now I'm just like the way I'm feeling it, and you can probably talk about other things that people are feeling, what they can do about it, is I need to get rid of all my clients and get some new ones, which requires sales, marketing, and all these other efforts that we've never really pursued with the current resources. So what would you say are other things, and how can people manage to find that market fit and get to the first M?
Well, the first thing is to identify, does the business and the entrepreneur have a unique value proposition, or are the customers primarily buying the talent of the entrepreneur, leveraged by the people that work for them? So probably an illustration would be, there was a guy that came out of the audience many years ago, and he said, I'm in no man's land, and he was in the used aircraft parts business. And
Mm-hmm.
so I asked him what he was good at, which was kind of a puzzling response to his, request for me to, give him a prescription. And I kept pounding him on that. And he finally said, well, Doug, to be honest with you, I'm really good at buying right. And I said, what do you mean buying right? He said, well, I know what my customers' parts needs are as they refurbish out aircraft. I go to the parts refurbishing business and effectively buy them right, because I know what our customers will pay for them, and I flip them to the customer. So I said, effectively, you're good at buying right. You have a trading company. So you have to create a process that buys right, or the company falls apart, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
finding that value proposition a lot of times is inwardly looking for the entrepreneur to find out what they were good at. The other interesting thing is as you look at your customer set, you kind of brought that to bear in your own business. Many times we find out that some of the biggest customers are one-off value propositions that are not scalable to an industry, and you have to fire your biggest customer to grow. Now that sounds counterintuitive, but what happens is that one exceptional client eats the bandwidth of the entire organization, and nobody in the marketplace wants to buy what you're selling to that client. And you got to get that bandwidth back and take what the marketplace wants and then scale that up. And as you pointed out, flipping to the second M, the third M, the model, the most expensive part of a business nowadays, many times, is the cost of acquiring a new customer. And so you got to make sure that you have something that somebody else can articulate in the marketplace and go out and win new customers to extend your bandwidth as an entrepreneur, or you don't have a business that can scale.
Right. Yeah, and that does make sense, because when you're on the wave initially, you kind of go with what creates revenue, but that may be exactly like you said, one-off, not scalable models, and it's just not going to work. So, going to would you like to talk about management next, or model? Because you mentioned the model.
I think the management would be interesting in your audience, and this is a really, really difficult transition. So in your business and in any business, no matter what the size of it, there's an inner circle. So if there's a really, really big decision that's going to be made in your business, there's a certain group of people going to be in your office. It could very well be an outside advisor, could be a spouse in a smaller business, but whatever. But it's usually a group of folks in the business that are going to be there. And the ticket to that inner circle in the early days is loyalty. It's loyalty to you, loyalty to the idea. These people were there when you didn't know whether they're going to get paid. You couldn't have got to where you are without them, right?
Mm-hmm.
The issue is that as you scale and let go of pieces of the business to get control back, you cannot afford for everybody around you to be doing something for the first time and learning it as you go. Now, what that entails also is that the ticket to the inner circle, when you move from what I call human scale and loyalty to financial scale, the ticket to the inner circle can't be loyalty anymore, has to be performance. And so what you find is that some of these folks that are in your inner circle, you can't afford to keep them there, and you got to bring somebody else in that, well, I'll use the previous illustration, use aircraft parts business. The entrepreneur, in order to get scale, has to concentrate on a small group of people and a process that buys right, so he can get the business to where it buys right on behalf of its customers. But a large part of that business was logistics. Well, there are folks in other industries that know more about the logistics than anybody that he has managing that business, and he needs to get some people in there that know what the business should look like, at a larger size, and they know the vendors, they know the prices. The right people in the inner circle reduces the risk, and it increases the speed of decisions that need to be made. So when you go to get rid of somebody that's been there from the very beginning, it's extraordinarily traumatic and something a lot of entrepreneurs won't face. My guess is that anybody that's in that 20 to 100 employee range that's listening to this has some folks in their inner circle that they need to deal with, and everybody in the company is waiting for them to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a very emotional kind of transition.
Right. So, I do have, for the people I talked to and the people that recommended your book in the first place, the management was the biggest impact to kind of the way they structured and had the perspective on building their business. And in regards to, and I do have a lot of things I want to talk about here, but I think one of the things you pointed out was, and let me know if I got this right, was you are doing something right in that gentleman example, buying right, but then there's other 5 or 6 processes that other people in other companies that you can hire do well. So really what people should do, and let me know if that's accurate, is map out all the things that should happen and then see which are the ones that they can do best and then hire the rest, or see what other ways they can manage them, right?
Yeah. but the problem is the entrepreneurs tend to hire in the middle and not at the top. And what does an entrepreneur do to their executives when they can't pay them enough? They give them titles. It's a title.
Right.
So you might have a chief financial officer that's really a bookkeeper. You might have a sales executive who's really a salesperson. You might have a COO who really is an office manager. And so the answer to your question, your comment is correct. The execution of it though means that you got to bring some folks in that at a different level. And
Right.
a lot of times, I'm sure some of your folks out there are going, well, that's great, Tatum. How do I afford somebody at that level? And the answer is sometimes you have to open up the capital structure. You have to create an executive comp plan. You might have to share a piece of the business in the right way. And that has to be done correctly because you won't hire the right people up front all the time correctly. And you have to get rid of those. But that transition is really key to getting out of no man's land.
Right. Sorry, you were saying something?
No.
Okay. So regarding that, I've noticed, like you said, that the transition from getting the team that brought you to where you are, the way you guys have done it, you now realize that they cannot take you to where you want to go. How do you differentiate? And you've said something about the ticket to being at that table, but just wanted to clarify if that's the only thing. How do you differentiate between the people that have been with you but cannot take you to where you want to go and the people that have been with you but may be able to still be part of the table? Is that only the actual performance of the individual?
I mean, a lot of it's, there are obviously exceptions and people that can make the transition, but not many of them is the bottom line. A perfect example is I had a young lady call me at the request of Inc. magazine one time, and she had a massively growing internet clothing business, and it's a fashion business. So as you can imagine, it's a very short cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Asked her what she was really, really good at, and she was really, really good at figuring out what women between a certain age group, mid 20s to 35, particularly on the West Coast, wanted to wear. And she was fastidious about the models, the cut, the fit. And if she let go of that, the business was going to blow up. But then, as you well know, in that kind of business, you have to offshore manufacturing. You got inventory, you got logistics, you got all sorts of things around the website. And I asked her, did she know of anybody, did she know of other companies that were much bigger than her firm that she admired in the fashion business? She named a few of them. I said, well, you need to go steal some of their executives because the minute one of them walks in the door, they know exactly how to set all that up. Whereas somebody internally would have to learn that. You don't have time to do it. They would know what vendors to use offshore. They would know what the pricing would be. They would know what systems to use because they had already experienced that at scale somewhere else, if that makes sense.
Right, right. No, that does make sense. And regarding to the senior management kind of deal, I've noticed that there's really two sides of this, and let me know your thoughts and advice on this. There's really the people that say, oh, I will never hire senior management. They know how to manage, but they don't know how to do things. So how they could ever actually manage the operation. But on the other side, have people that manage to do it well. So do you think it's about hiring the right people that have been through that and are seniors now? Or you're also a pro of hiring people that may not know exactly what you're doing, but are in the senior position and they know how to handle that from their past experiences, if that makes
Well,
sense?
I think what you do is you look for uh, folks that have done what you need to be done within your business at a larger size. I don't think you just go out and hire somebody because they've been an executive in a larger company. They need to have applicable experience directly into what you're doing, but have done that at scale because then they know all the shortcuts. And that's what you're looking. You're looking for quicker less risky decisions based on domain expertise around the process you want them to own in your business.
Right. And what would you say about because before I in my research I had a conversation with like 6 people to kind of put down the questions, right? And one of the things that came up was, one, why would those people join from such a big company to a smaller company? What would be the things that would make them join? And second was the price function, which I don't really agree with, but I would love your thoughts, because if they're doing all those things, you really can't afford not to have them. So what do you think about that?
Well, why would somebody join? Well, first of all, it's a really good way of having an outside perspective on your business. If they're not willing to join you, they don't see a lot of prospects for the business, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if they look at your business, and let's say that they're not a COO in a larger organization, but they're right under a COO, they might have a long time to wait before they get a shot at that position in a larger company, and they could step into that position in a smaller company. And then thirdly, as it relates to what you call the price or the compensation, you're going to have to create some upside for them. So if they look at a company, XYZ company, and they say, wow, they have a unique value proposition. They're disrupting this industry. They've got some unique ideas that they're implementing. I think that this thing's going to grow. Well, then they get a chance to hook their horse to that wagon. That's what you're going to have to find out. Now, if they come in and you can't get a lot of enthusiasm about that, then that says something about your prospects to grow, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that. Yeah, I agree with that too, because I mean, reading from people like the founders of Google and everything else, and like Eric, who's the CEO, I mean, he's not a CEO anymore, but he's been for a while, since the beginning of the company. He said that the only thing you should do as a founder and CEO when you're hiring the people is to sell them the dream. If you can't do that, then why would they work there?
Right.
So I agree 100%. Okay. And what about processes and systems? And then we'll move on to the next ones. A lot of people really have a hard time creating this. So my question would be, what is the way that people can go about building these processes and systems? A lot of entrepreneurs, me included, we're not great at that. So should entrepreneurs get a operations person or some other people to create those processes and systems based on what we already do, or what have you seen work in that transition to systemize and make the company work in that sense?
Well, if you bring in the right people into your inner circle that have seen how larger companies operate, they define that for you. In other words, that's what you're asking them to do. The entrepreneur's never seen how a company like theirs operates at scale. And when I say scale, at larger size. If you bring folks in that understand it, so let's go back to the illustration of used aircraft parts. He might have a whole group of people running around picking up parts, shipping parts, inventorying parts. You get the right person in there, they're going to know what system to put into place. They're going to know how to organize the players into the right roles, and that's where you get your efficiencies. And
Right.
the companies in no man's land survive by everybody working hard and caring enough to to pick up the exceptions or pick up the pieces, but you can't scale that. It just blows apart. So you're going to have to get it organized, and you bring that organization in when you hire at the top the right people.
Right. Got it.
Let
And would you
let
go
them
ahead? Sorry.
organize, let them organize underneath them.
Mm. Mm. And would you say there's any cases in which there's companies that are so innovative that there's no people that have done that before? Do you think that exists? If you understand my
Not, not,
question.
not to my knowledge. I think if you went back and looked at any of the high profile larger companies that got started off the ground, you're going to find that they inserted, you know, uh, executives into those companies as they grew. It doesn't mean
Mm-hmm.
there wouldn't be some folks that started and are still there at the top, but it'll be very few.
Right.
Now,
Cool.
the visionary, the entrepreneur, uh, too many times they get substituted out. But as in the case of the woman's fashion business, you get rid of her, you're going to lose the value proposition because she knows what fashion trends to pick, and that's what she's uniquely good at. And she needs to surround herself with some more people that can do that. But certain organizations bring in quote unquote a senior executive replace the entrepreneur. I've seen as many tragedies with that as I have the outsider actually succeeding.
Right. And would you say the smarter thing to do would be to keep the visionary, but most of the times probably not in operations, or just surround with great people around their weaknesses and keep their strength, and maybe get somebody on that later, but not the first thing, because there's all these other things that they're not doing right. Would you say
Yeah,
that's accurate?
it's really up to the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur has got to consistently and constantly work their way out of a job, because if they don't, then the business is going to be tied to them. And what you do is you want the business's value proposition to be instilled and institutionalized in the company, and that's where the value is, and that's what allows it to scale. So
Right.
it all boils down to the entrepreneur. If they don't know how to let go to get control, they're going to lose control.
Right, right. Yeah, I agree with that. And we're gonna move up to the model. You just see like you have like the Facebooks that the Mark maybe is a CEO, but he's not actually involved operationally at any level. He's just a strategic CEO at a high level. And then but then he has Cheryl, which is a very seasoned executive as a COO. So you have all these things that happened, and some of them worked, some of them didn't. It comes down to what the entrepreneur chooses. So let's go to the model. What do you think? And we have model and the money, and then we'll wrap up in about 2 or 3 minutes. But let's briefly talk about this one as well. What do you think people should approach their model and do that?
Well, for one thing, they need to realize there's a point where they will sense, and you might sense it in your own business right now, where you need to build more infrastructure than your current revenues can handle. We call it stepped fixed cost. The costs don't go up gradually, they go up dramatically during this transition. And you need to understand if there is a profit zone north of that. So there are some businesses, I'll pick on yours for a second, as I understand, as an advertising agency,
Mm-hmm.
social market. There's a lot of very prosperous, profitable, small ad agencies in this country. And then there's some really big ones. And my gut feeling is if I was to look at the data, it's really hard to be kind of in the middle. You're either big enough to where your value proposition allows you to serve clients in multiple cultures and multiple locations, or you're very boutique and built around some specific expertise in some niche industries. So, and there's a big gap there. So what you find a lot is that smaller ad agencies get bought all the time by the big ones. They don't
Yes.
really scale; they get bought because the big ones have the infrastructure and they want those clients. So you got to really think strategically about, you know, where do you make money? And we have data, and there's some data in the book that shows that there are industries where there's a no profit zone, and you don't want to grow yourself into a business where your infrastructure costs jump up immediately. It creates economic difficulties, and you can't get the revenues up to the point where you scale again because the gap is too wide. So
Right.
and there, and I think that for your audiences, look around. If you're in the middle and making money, and there's nobody else there, then it means you might have some unique process or something allows you to do that. But if you're in the smaller side and there's nobody in the middle out there, there's probably a reason for it.
Right. Right. Yeah, it does make sense. And I think the economies of scale, especially when you're based on actual people to do things like an advertising agency, or when you have software, I mean, not software focused, that's different. But when you have these kind of, and it's true what you've said, there's really not a lot of companies between the 200 and 1,000 employees mark, but there are a couple of huge giants with 50,000, 100,000 people. And then there's a lot of like 20, 10, 7, 24, stuff like that companies. So what companies should be doing is really find out, like if there's a profit zone, and then kind of transition onto that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, you need to look at the business. You need to get a financial projection model out of your CFO or consultant, so you can test under certain assumptions. If I'm going to do this and do that, when do I get economies of scale? When do those profits return based on the infrastructures that I'm going to have to build? And then look around competitively and make sure that that makes common sense before you just grow yourself out of business.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what do you think about money? And I think this is close to. I want to give you an example, and I don't know if this is under the money M or the model. What we've seen though is a big change we've made in the last 6 months is we've projected the cost structure that we're going to have, with all the management that we need, with all the costs that we projected we are going to have in a month or 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 or 12, and then charged upfront our clients and the new clients that we're getting based on the expenses that we're going to have versus the cheap cost structure that we have at the moment. So is that the money part, or how would you say there's the action part
That's
there?
that's very much the model part, but it relates directly to the money. You know the what attracts capital is profits and cash flow, and the capital markets. What the entrepreneurs don't, you and me and anybody else that's been an entrepreneur, when we get up every day, what we have to do is think about the potential of the business, right? Well, capital markets can figure out the potential of the business in about 3 seconds. What they don't know is what the risk of the business is. So
Mm,
what's really, really interesting, I mean, kind of the navigation rule in the money is you decrease the risk and or the perceived risk of the business, then the capital markets will find it. And the way you do that many times is to sit down and literally, as an entrepreneur, go, would I buy my own business? What risks do I have, and how do I get rid of those risks? And one of that you just brought up is that you're built your business to a certain degree by being highly effective but very inexpensive. Somewhere along the line, you need to get paid for being highly effective. And so the question then becomes, our big, one of your risks is that you got to price your stuff correctly or you can't scale. And you've already got a handle on that. But that's an example of what you have to do to attract capital to a business.
right, and that's the money part.
That's the money part.
Got it. Cool. So I know we went a little bit on off time. So what I'll do is, if there's anything you'd like to add, and then I'd really love for you to give us a 1-2 minute, kind of where can people learn more about you, your ventures right now? Can people collaborate, or does your company, Newport Board Group, does any consulting? Like, how can people reach more of you and maybe work with what you're doing at the moment?
So,
Unless you want to add something to what we're doing. So.
well, no, I think if I could add one or tie up the session, I think it's important for your listeners to understand that no man's land is a real transition. It's not them. Uh, I have huge respect for what entrepreneurs do and build. And so, part of the reason for the book is to make sure they understand that the transition they're facing is not unique to their personality. It's unique to any business that's going to go and get to economies of scale or financial scale. If they want to know more about Newport, they ought to check out the website at Newport Board Group. What we find is you need an outside catalyst sometimes as an entrepreneur, somebody as an operating executive who's been there and done that. that you can have confidential conversations about, to kind of gird your gut instincts about what you need to do in the business. There's a lot of talk about having advisory boards, et cetera, but what we find is that those can create a lot of bandwidth issues and not really serve the same purpose as having somebody co-pilot with you on an advisory basis, and that's what Newport does. And these are all executives that understand the transition through no man's land, know what it looks like on the other side, and can effectively help you as an entrepreneur become radically objective about what you need to do, and get you to the next side, or make sure that you, quite frankly, don't try to scale when you might have a great small business and need to stay that way.
Right, right. Well, Doug, thank you so much for your time, firstly, and for everybody that's listening. I don't say this lightly, but I would. I mean, I gave probably 50 of your books away as gifts. But I would highly recommend anybody that's listening, just pick up the book if you're going through that transition, because it's just, to me was, I mean, the power of a story really is for you to be able to resonate with it. So when I was reading the book, I was like, this is the best story ever, because I resonate with every single thing he says. Which proves the point what you just said, that it's not me, it's not him, it's not her, it's everybody. It's a transition that people need to go through. So I recommend everybody that's listening to go pick up your book. It's available everywhere. Just search for No Man's Land on Amazon or wherever you get your books. And yeah, thank you so much for your time, Doug. Really appreciate it.
Well, Catalin, enjoyed talking with you. Good luck.
Thank you so much.